Thank you all for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all this week. It's been such an incredible opportunity. I feel so honored by the chance to meet you all and learn with you. I know it's going to continue to shape my thinking in the future, and I'm really grateful for that. So the work I'm presenting today is a draft of some thoughts on the civic thought of W.E.B. Du Bois. My focus is going to be on Du Bois's attempt to wrestle with the legacy of American Reconstruction and the possibilities of reconstructing democracy in the 1920s and 30s. Oh, sorry. That's maybe better. I think if you all can hear me, this is probably... my focus is going to be on W.E.B. Du Bois's attempt to wrestle with the legacy of American Reconstruction and the possibilities of reconstructing democracy in the 1920s and 30s, which is a critical junction in his thought. As I'll suggest, central to Du Bois's effort is his attempt to think through what sort of citizenship, what civic ideals and dispositions such reconstruction would demand, a vision, I will argue, that in many ways centers on Du Bois's democratic account of beauty. Du Bois is part of a long tradition of African-American intellectuals whose thought reflects an effort to live a democratic life in undemocratic times, a struggle summarized most succinctly by Ralph Ellison's famous line in his Working Notes to Juneteenth: "This society is not likely to become free of racism. Thus, it is necessary for Negroes to free themselves by becoming their idea of what a free people should be." What does it mean to be a democratic citizen when denied membership in a democratic community? Democracy's defining characteristic, of course, is ruled by the people. So can one truly be said to have democratic citizenship when prevailing law, institutions, and much of the public understands the true identity of the American people as white or male or wealthy? And if so, what would the qualities of that citizenship look like? Most studies of African-American democratic thought tend to focus on a crucial but ultimately distinct set of concerns to the ones I just posed. They ask, how have Black Americans sought to reimagine and reshape American peoplehood, changing who is included and under what terms in that famous line from our Constitution's preamble, "We the people of the United States." This is, for instance, the focus of Frederick Douglass's famous 1852 address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." Here, Douglass at once condemns the exclusion of Black Americans from American democracy, as well as their subjection under slavery, while also laying claim to the principles of the Constitution as a member of We the People. Refashioning our ideas of American peoplehood is also, of course, one of the main thrusts of the civil rights movement that we're studying this week, where voting rights and integration were often, although not exclusively, understood as part of an effort to realize multiracial democratic community on just terms. The most famous example in this regard, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which we heard an excerpt of on Tuesday. While that speech actually presents a more comprehensive vision, than is sometimes supposed, a core facet of the dream in King's speech is, of course, the realization of a truly multiracial democratic version of We the People. So there are good reasons for focusing on these efforts to realize American democracy. But if we want to think about the long history of the Black freedom movement and its lessons, I want to suggest it's also crucial to confront the efforts of Black intellectuals and social movements to deal with the impasse that so often faces those seeking freedom and justice, the stubbornness of the structures of racial domination that characterize American democracy, the exasperating persistence of racialized ideas of American peoplehood. It does not mean denying that justice is possible, or that transformation is possible, of course. Rather, it means considering what happens in the meantime, right, in the long junctures before transformation. Some of the most compelling, moving, generative statements of what it means to be a democratic citizen confront precisely this question. Black intellectuals, artists, and social movements have sought to reimagine democratic citizenship when the possibility of genuine democracy appears most distant. Forced by circumstance, but expanded through their effort and innovation, they offer a picture of democracy that centers on democratic life in the absence of democratic membership. The ideals, dispositions, and sorts of relationships built on them that can emerge in the context of impasse. W.E.B. Du Bois is a key figure in this history. W.E.B. Du Bois is a key figure in this history that I seek to sketch. A co-founder of the NAACP, formative patron and theorist of the Harlem Renaissance, a crucial force behind 20th century Pan-Africanism, and a founder of American sociology. His influence on Black political thought cannot be overstated, including on the movement leaders and intellectuals of the civil rights movement of the middle of the 20th century. Du Bois died the evening before the 1963 March on Washington, a defining moment of the civil rights movement, of course, and a pause was taken in that event to honor his memory. My remarks today focus on Du Bois's efforts to reimagine democratic citizenship, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, as I mentioned. At the center of that account is the legacy and lost promise of the Reconstruction era. In fact, throughout his long life, Du Bois observed in the world around him the outcome of the fall of American Reconstruction. It was a moment at the dawn of emancipation when freedom was to be distinguished from slavery through legal measures, most importantly, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, and political and economic guarantees for freedmen. Du Bois famously calls Reconstruction's democratic model abolition democracy, a concept which has inspired contemporary thinkers, most notably Angela Davis in her wonderful book, which is also called Abolition Democracy. At the heart of this account is political control of the South by a democratic majority of Black and white workers, equipped with the rights and resources to be free of the domination of any master. Such freedom required, importantly, a whole reworking of the politics and economy of the South, including the redistribution of land and goods, the institution of public schools, hospitals, fair courts, voting rights, and other provisions. After its abandonment with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1877, Du Bois writes that American democracy was, quote, murdered so completely that the world does not recognize its corpse, living on in the heart of Black folks alone. As early as the selves of Black folk, and up to his landmark 1935 history, Black Reconstruction, which is the work I'm going to be focusing on for much of today's discussion, the period cast a shadow over Du Bois's political thought, resembling, as it still does, a lost possibility of multiracial democracy, at once a tragedy and a model for what democracy might be. But Reconstruction was not only past and future. In the 1920s and 30s, Du Bois sought ways of realizing aspects of Reconstruction's democracy amid the realities of American racial domination, both through Black political and economic cooperation, and by reshaping collective civic dispositions and ideals from those inherited from slavery. This latter effort is the subject of my remarks today. As Paul Taylor has argued, during Reconstruction and in the decades that followed, culture workers continued to use visual art, song, oratory, drama, literature, and other forms to insist on Black humanity, to reimagine racially oppressive and exploitative social arrangements, and to call attention to the damage that white supremacy was doing to Black life and to the causes of democracy and justice. I read W.B. Du Bois's thought from this period in this vein. Du Bois was pessimistic about the possibility of multiracial democracy in the near term, but he also sought, especially in the years following the Harlem Renaissance, the contours of an alternative ethos to define democratic citizenship, not only in the future, but in the unjust present. So my discussion is going to proceed in three parts. First, I want to very briefly consider Du Bois's critique of some of the dominant ideals and dispositions he believed prevailed in American political life and culture, and of course that characterized white citizenship in particular. These ideals and dispositions, he argues, proved fatal to Reconstruction in the post-war period and continued to thwart the possibility of multiracial democracy in his own moment. Second, I want to consider Du Bois's answer to these challenges. As I'll suggest, Du Bois's ideal of democratic citizenship in the critical period I'm discussing today centers on a civic ideal of beauty. As Du Bois recognized, focusing on beauty as a response to the harsh realities of Jim Crow domination may at first sound surprising or even wholly irrelevant. But as I hope to show, Du Bois seeks to establish an alternative foundation for civic life from what he sees as an invidious, immoral, and unreasonable politics that Americans, and particularly white Americans, have inherited from slavery. Beauty, for Du Bois, is not just aesthetic, but rather entails important epistemic and moral commitments that can animate citizens engaged in democratic association toward the construction of a beautiful society. I close finally with some reflections on the implications of Du Bois's account for what citizenship might look like in slightly more practical terms. And this last section draws, in particular, on Melvin Rogers' recent, very important work, and it centers on the ways judgment, in this case aesthetic judgment, serves as a democratic practice and invites thoughts about the meaning of Du Bois's account for the conversations we're having this week. While Du Bois offers a number of reasons for the fall of Reconstruction and the continuing failure of America to realize its vision, maybe the most famous lesson of his 1935 history of the period centers on the deficits of white citizenship, evidenced by the ways whites across classes tended to privilege their hierarchical racial status above democratic principles. This was true, as Du Bois notes, even for those whites, and especially poor and disenfranchised working class whites, who actually had the most to gain from what he calls abolition democracy, right, by reconstructing democracy. This is a complex account, but important for our present discussion is that Du Bois understood that white citizens, whether or not they were slaveholders, nevertheless widely shared ideals and dispositions inherited from the system of slavery. Ella Myers has recently, I think very usefully, described what she calls an ethos of ownership, characterizing white citizens in the United States. This is what she calls a possessive stance, I'm quoting here, a mode of relationality that regards the world, and crucially, its non-white inhabitants and the places they live, as property or potentially so. This ethos forms part of what Du Bois would later refer to as the social heritage of slavery, continuing into the 20th century and today. The multiracial working class alliance Du Bois believed to be at the heart of the project of reconstructing American democracy could not be sustained if the ideals and practices of a substantial portion of Americans, a substantial portion of the body politic, were centered on command and exploitation. Two aspects of this account are going to be particularly important for our discussion. First, this ethos encourages a zero-sum orientation on the part of working class Americans, really all white Americans, toward black freedom and prosperity. This is probably the most famous discussion, the most famous claim of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. While white workers did not gain the full material benefits of the capitalist economy, they could largely be counted on, he argues, to refuse alliances with bondspeople before the war and black workers thereafter. This was because whiteness offered a certain hierarchical status over black Americans, as well as comparative political and economic advantages. It was, Du Bois argues, for these advantages that the majority of white Americans cast aside their democratic principles. As he writes, and please excuse the volume of text on the next two slides, they were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost entirely ignored the Negro except in crime and ridicule. The effect of this was that the orientation of whites to black Americans was not as democratic partners, not equal democratic citizens, but as eternal competition to be subordinated. Black gain was seen comparatively as white loss, and black freedom was seen comparatively as white unfreedom. We actually see this in the book we read for the seminar, Fry Gaillard's Cradle of Freedom, when he speaks later on in the book of Robert Chambliss, the mastermind behind the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 girls and seriously wounded a 5th. There he writes that Chambliss, the one-time member of the United Mine Workers Union, quote, was not concerned about economics. For whatever dark intermingling of reasons, he was preoccupied only with the divine right of whites to occupy a rung on the ladder above blacks. A second important point here. Du Bois describes the effects of slavery on norms of reason and public discussion. Writing of the antebellum period, he notes that, quote, the mere fact that the man could be, under the law, the actual master of the mind and body of human beings had to have disastrous effects. It tended to inflate the ego of most planters beyond all reason. They became arrogant, strutting, quarrelsome kinglets. They issued commands, they made laws, they shouted their orders, they expected deference and self-abasement, they were choleric and easily insulted. They did not tolerate dissent, and, quote, the men who dared such thought and act were driven out or suppressed with a virulent tyranny reminiscent of the Inquisition and Reformation. Up to Du Bois's own day, he writes that, quote, to an astonishing degree, the honest South allows known lies to stand uncontradicted. As already hinted, these remarks are not merely historical. Du Bois also found in the contemporary white working class movement ideals and dispositions that reflected the commitment to domination and which continued to frustrate the possibility of democratic reconstruction. White labor's racial hostility in the 30s was, for the antebellum white, as for the antebellum white, quote, a deliberate attention to keep Negroes and Mexicans and other elements of common labor in a lower proletariat as subservient to the interests as theirs to the interests of capital. Imperialism simply extended this relationship, he argued, globalizing the role once reserved to the overseer by bribing, quote, the white worker by high wages, visions of wealth, and the opportunity to dominate others. These civic ideals and dispositions, derived from slavery and its aftermath, formed a model of citizenship animating white Americans and were for Du Bois a key roadblock to the possibility of reconstructing American democracy. I want to turn now to Du Bois's response to the foregoing in the form of the cultural reconstruction he saw in the 1920s and 1930s. Reconstructing democracy, this new reconstruction for the 20th century, meant, among other things, reforming the values and practices underlying U.S. society. And for Du Bois, I want to suggest, beauty was the ideal at the root of this project. As Du Bois himself noted in his landmark 1926 address, Criteria of Negro Art, an address he gave before an audience of the NAACP, this might sound incongruous, right? We're moving from a discussion of violent domination and anti-democratic ideals to aesthetic concerns, right? To talking about art and beauty. But in speaking of beauty, Du Bois is considering at once a quality of society and an ideal guiding the activity of democratic citizens. Its incongruity from the concerns discussed so far is, in part, precisely because beauty represents for Du Bois a foundation to our society that's completely different from the ethos of citizenship which prevailed around him, from the civic ideals and habits which prevailed around him. What is democratic about beauty, and how might Du Bois's vision depart from that presented in section 1? Part of the answer lies in the fact that, for Du Bois, beauty does not simply refer to aesthetic pleasure, but to an ideal with moral and epistemic implications. Returning to Criteria of Negro Art, which that's actually the image on your left, as it appeared in The Crisis in 1926, Du Bois argues that truth and goodness, or as he also puts it, the facts of the world and the right actions of men, and beauty, are here and now in the world in which I work, for me, unseparated and inseparable. That which is beautiful is also true and good, he argues, because the freedom of the artist is always, quote, bounded by truth and justice. Likewise, to receive some expression as beautiful, to judge something as beautiful, he seems to say, is at once to feel moved by its goodness and to reach some understanding that is reflective of its truth. Expression that violates one's moral sense, or on the other hand, that fails to reflect truth or inspire a new, widened understanding of reality, also does not serve to be judged as beautiful. Elsewhere, Du Bois offers a complex argument as to why exactly it might be that beauty should also always be true and good. After all, we don't typically think that a portrait needs to be true, right, or accurate or something in order to be beautiful, nor that a beautiful portrait is morally good in the same way other praiseworthy things might be. I'm maybe conveniently going to leave this argument aside for the time being, although I'm happy to return to it if people are interested. As a good student of pragmatism, I don't think Du Bois would object necessarily to the idea that for the moment it's useful to accept these conclusions. So what makes this idea of beauty political? Most readers understand the politics of beauty in Du Bois's formulation in terms of his statements on the political function of art. Black creative expression, Du Bois suggests, has the power to persuade audiences when reasoned argument might not. Evidence of biologists, historians, and sociologists might not convince whites of the reality of black humanity and the self-defeating character of their hatred. But sometimes powerful images, narratives, and sounds can do so. And as Du Bois famously and controversially argues, black artists have a duty to work toward the collective emancipation of black Americans through their art, producing compelling representations of black life and culture, correcting misperceptions, and offering new visions of the good. This is the reasoning behind his often misunderstood claim that, quote, all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. Most of us who spend a lot of time thinking about Du Bois take this as the essence of his politics of beauty. Beauty is political because beautiful art has persuasive power. It's a politics of art for artists. But I think this is a little too narrow of a statement of Du Bois's democratic thought. For Du Bois, beauty isn't just something that characterizes art. Beauty characterizes society and the actions of its citizens. And in a democratic society, beauty is the province of cooperative action, what might usefully be termed a civic artistry, in our efforts to reconstruct and reproduce society. Such artistry is a creative act, guided, just as the painter or musician, by an ideal of beauty and its attendant qualities, goodness and truth. Du Bois makes maybe his most complex case for the cultivation of beauty as an aspect of democratic citizenship in his very important, but often overlooked 1938 address, The Revelations of St. Orne the Damned, which he gave before Fisk University. That address, a collection of the experiences and prophecies of St. Orne, O-R-G-N-E, it's an anagram for Negro, who stands in for the wisdom of Du Bois's own Fisk graduating class 5 decades prior, covers 7 broad themes, including the family, primary schooling, the university, work, morality, art and beauty, and democracy. It's a useful address for summarizing Du Bois's views on the present subject. Like any good commencement speaker, Du Bois is here presenting for his audience both an idea of what constitutes the good, the good life, as well as the actions it involves in his audience in their future as citizens. So in the penultimate section of that address, Du Bois makes a really striking claim. Art, he writes, which is experience of life, increases and grows the more widely it is shared. Here lie the rock foundations of democracy. This is a formulation that I admit I find puzzling, but let me try to offer one interpretation among several that I think are possible here. We might break this formulation down to 3 parts. Art is experience of life. Art is non-exclusive. In fact, it increases and grows through its sharing. And democracy rests in some way on these facts. Beginning with the first, in what sense is art experience of life? Or better, what is life exactly, such that we might define art in this way? Earlier in the address, Du Bois defines life as follows. Life is the fullest, most complete enjoyment of the possibilities of human existence. When Du Bois speaks of art, then, he's thinking of fulfillment in the widest terms. Certainly painting, music, dance, theater, and so on can be fulfilling, and perhaps honing one's creative capacities is one way of enjoying, as he says, the possibilities of human existence. But what's interesting here is that he's speaking of art as experience of life in the context not of, the activity of somebody in their studio or on the stage of a theater, but in the context of democracy as a whole. What sort of creative activity, then, what sort of possibilities might Du Bois have in mind? If art is experience of life, in this context, it seems to mean collective life. And the sort of creative work that Du Bois has in mind, the creative activity art might involve, would seem to have some kind of a civic character. Du Bois writes, secondly, that art increases and grows the more widely it is shared. As I just noted, if we understand art as democratic in some way, then this already suggests that it is something collective or shared in a certain respect. But why would it increase and grow through its sharing? And what does this have to do with democracy per se? One answer, which he seems to offer later in the address and in some of his earlier writings on democracy, is that sharing our knowledge, experience, and creativity is an important condition for realizing the possibilities of existence he speaks of. Art requires us to be open to others. It can't be the work of a solitary voice. And maybe this is doubly so for the civic artistry Du Bois may have in mind. If the artist, Du Bois says, is guided by truth and justice, it may be that creative activity at the collective level must be guided by an openness to as wide a range of voices as possible, a solicitude toward their knowledge and imagination under conditions of equal respect. This is what Du Bois seems to suggest when he describes democracy as a means of loosing the possibilities of mankind for the development of a higher and broader and more varied human culture. Democracy then forms not merely a reservoir of complaint, but of ability, hidden otherwise in poverty and ignorance. Democracy means the opening of opportunity to the disinherited to contribute to civilization and the happiness of men. What results from this democratic activity has a collective, non-exclusive character, and it contrasts with the sorts of goods that white citizens pursue in the last section when Du Bois is critiquing white citizenship and its exclusionary character. One might consider the parallel claim here that Du Bois makes about beauty in Criteria of Negro art, where he states that its variety is infinite, its possibility endless. In normal life, all may have it and have it yet again. The product of the activity we're describing is part of the building of a beautiful egalitarian society. We might summarize civic artistry in Du Bois's sense as a collective activity that makes use of collective material, such as the knowledge and experience and expression of our fellow citizens, in order to render a shared beautiful result, a beautiful society. I want to pause here briefly to consider the sorts of products of activity that Du Bois might have in mind. All right, what's a beautiful society look like, or what are beautiful things that are produced by citizens in Du Bois's terms? On this score, Du Bois is wide-ranging, offering descriptions of nature, art, and even politics. Music is certainly important in this case. Throughout his career, he often returned to the example of black spirituals, and in particular of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, whose world tour helped fund Fisk University, his alma mater. Maybe it's institutions like those we visited this week, right? Open to the public, and animated by a commitment to truth and justice. A less obvious, but I think really intriguing example also of civic artistry is presented in Black Reconstruction, when Du Bois describes as at once democratic and beautiful the actions of the emancipatory actions on the part of bondspeople, gained, as he notes, in large part by the actions of the bondspeople themselves, from sabotage to public pressure to, most prominently, what he calls the Great General Strike right, as bondspeople dropped their tools and joined the procession of Union armies. Describing the reception of the Emancipation Proclamation they had spurred, he writes that, quote, all that was beauty, all that was love, all that was truth stood on top of these mad mornings and sang with the stars. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. Emancipation here is a beautiful, good, and true thing brought into the world through the bondspeople's work and imagination. It reshapes, too, the world of white Americans to whom, quote, came a new vision and a new uplift, a sudden freeing of hateful mental shadows. At last, democracy was to be justified of its own children. The nation was to be purged of continual sin. In closing out this part of the talk, I want to consider for a moment how beauty as an ideal and as a good departs from the ideals and goods we just considered in Du Bois's account of white citizenship. White citizens, again, were animated by a desire for ownership and control over others, seeking the exclusive status whiteness offered them politically and socially, as well as comparative economic advantages over black Americans. But beauty, as we just saw, is different. Du Bois tells us all may have beauty, quote, and yet have it yet again. We don't spoil, say, a beautiful song by sharing it. In fact, to continue our example, we create beautiful songs by sharing our talents and inspiration with each other. I need the other members of my band, and once we've made something, we typically want to share it with the wider public for others to also experience that thing. And all that experiencing does nothing to diminish it. It's unchanged. So far, we've spoken of Du Bois's account of the dominant white ideals and practices of citizenship that, at least in part, frustrated the possibility of Reconstruction in the 1870s and into the 20th century. Just now, we considered Du Bois's efforts in the 20s and 30s to give an alternative account of citizenship, with beauty as a civic ideal at the center of that picture. Now, in this final part of our conversation, what I want to do is consider what Du Bois thought this alternative account might have looked like in more practical terms, right? Not for some future democracy, but for the undemocratic realities of his own time. Without economic and political rights that Reconstruction would have offered, without inclusion in We the People, what can citizenship modeled on the pursuit of beauty actually consist of in practice? It is in Du Bois's 1928 novel, Dark Princess, that he offers perhaps his most elaborate answer to these questions. Dark Princess is Du Bois's second novel, and it follows the journey of Matthew Towns, a black medical student, Pullman porter, Chicago politician, and later revolutionary and husband, to an Indian princess turned anti-colonial leader named Cotilia, the Princess of Bodpur. It remained Du Bois's favorite, actually, among his works. People don't often know that. This is something that he kind of placed above something like Souls of Black Folk, which many more of us read than Dark Princess. Although it did not enjoy typically positive reception as a novel. The critic and philosopher Elaine Locke's remark in a letter to Langston Hughes seems representative of its reception, writing to his friend that, quote, tonight I have to review Dark Princess for the New York Herald Tribune. He states, God help me. Whatever its failings as art, however, Dark Princess stands as a very useful meditation on the importance of beauty as a civic ideal in democratic times, among other merits of that work. I'm going to argue in closing that there are two facets to this for Du Bois. The first is that beauty as a civic ideal can animate how citizens evaluate the world around them and what it might be, as Du Bois puts it, if it were really a beautiful world. The second point is that sharing these judgments in the public sphere, sharing them with others, the second point is that sharing these judgments in the public sphere, which is precisely what Du Bois is doing in his writings and public addresses, is itself a form of democratic politics. I have to make a bit of a detour into the novel to get here, but the details I'm about to mention will hopefully make sense momentarily. The novel begins with a medical school dean's refusal to allow Matthew to enroll for an obstetrics course, objecting to the idea of black students treating white women patients. Disappointed and unsure where to turn, Matthew travels to Germany, where he meets Cotilia, princess of a fictional Indian state with whom he falls immediately in love. Cotilia's interest in Matthew, on the other hand, is at first not romantic, but political. She introduces Matthew to a committee of leaders from countries spanning Africa and Asia who are planning to revolt against white imperialism and the global color line it maintains. In support of this mission, Cotilia sends Matthew back to the United States as an observer of a black nationalist group that is, more or less modeled on Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and is run by a figure named Perigua, who is also modeled on Marcus Garvey, who was Du Bois's rival at that time. It had actually been deported the year prior to Dark Princess's publication. There's a long story here, but this half of the novel ends with Matthew's arrest and with Perigua's death, although his arrest is not because of Perigua's death. They're not related in that regard. I'm going to focus my remarks, however, on the novel's second half, which begins after Matthew receives a political pardon orchestrated by an ambitious black Chicago machine boss named Sammy Scott and his assistant, Sarah Andrews. Upon his release, Matthew, too, soon becomes a highly successful Chicago politician under their direction. Matthew and Sarah marry, and she plots his ascension to Congress. Matthew gains his legal freedom, he gains wealth, and he gains political power. He gains, in other words, some measure, by no means complete, of the good life of society, of the exclusive goods of wealth and political status, of which we spoke of earlier. Yet in precisely this moment in the novel, Matthew's judgments of beauty and ugliness become paramount. Although he is physically free, he's consumed with what Du Bois terms a persistent aesthetic disquiet with his new life. Du Bois describes Matthew's world as devoid of beauty or interest. The courthouse in which he is tried is a mighty gray stone structure with cold, soiled rooms. These are quotes. The judge himself has a grave, gray face, and Matthew wears a gray suit to his trial. Sammy's office is no different, a building with a dingy gray wooden door, a dirty linoleum rug that does not completely cover the softwood floor, as well as sash curtains of dingy white held up with rods. After the pardon, Du Bois describes Matthew's district, where he's a politician, as, quote, old, dirty, crowded, with staggering buildings. The streets were obstructed with bad pavings, ashes, and garbage. Even Matthew's apartment is composed, quote, of bare, cold, and dirty rooms. This is actually, I was looking for gray buildings, and this is a building that you can find apparently in this something called the Ugly Buildings Tour in Chicago. So I thought it was appropriate for this context. These judgments of the ugliness of Matthew's world, moreover, come with moral indictments and charges of falsehood. In order to participate in this life, Matthew must do so, quote, deliberately and with his eyes closed. The struggle he feels in his soul as a politician is a, quote, revolt against things unsuitable, ill-adjusted, and in bad taste, the illogical lack of fundamental harmony, the unnecessary dirt and waste, the ugliness of it all. In order to gain his Republican nomination, Matthew has been persuaded into forming a coalition with big business and racist unions. He promises each contrary things at the expense of the interests of his black constituents and more radical labor organizations. This bad faith and his betrayal of his constituents dissatisfies him even as it guarantees his electoral victory. Quote, he was paying a price for money and power, a great, terrible price. He was lying, cheating, and stealing. He was fooling these poor, driven slaves of industry. So Matthew's predicament, more or less, is that of someone whose ideals of beauty accord with those we described in the previous section of our discussion. Beauty isn't just pleasurable, and ugliness isn't just unpleasant. It is a moral and epistemic thing. It has something to do with goodness and truth. So what's Matthew to do? Matthew's dissatisfaction in the foregoing parallels a general challenge Du Bois describes in his address, Criteria of Negro Art, that I mentioned previously. on the part of Black Americans as a whole. In both cases, beauty as a civic ideal drives people's judgment of their society and what it might be. There, he poses the following. What do we want? What is the thing we are after? We want to be Americans, full-fledged Americans, with all of the rights of other American citizens. But is that all? Do we simply want to be Americans? Once in a while, through all of us, there flashes some clairvoyance, some clear idea of what America really is. We who are dark can see America in a way that white Americans do not. And seeing our country thus, are we satisfied with its present goals and ideals? Being American, or having the things America values for its members, here is not enough to cure the aesthetic disquiet of Du Bois's audience, nor is Matthew's inclusion in the halls of democratic power or his growing wealth. But while a society animated by beautiful ideals may be out of reach, beauty as a civic ideal still animates judgment. Beauty is, in this respect, not unlike the second sight that Du Bois famously describes in The Part of Black Americans and the Souls of Black Folk, a deep insight into the reality and moral character of a world defined by white racism and its ideals. Judgments of beauty offer a framework through which Matthew, like Du Bois's audience, can assess the society in which they live. They can better understand the moral and spiritual stakes of their participation in that society, of becoming Americans simply. Rather, their ideals exceed those animating American democracy, and therefore so do their judgments of that democracy. So while a perfectly beautiful society or a truly democratic society may be on the distant horizon, their imagination and judgment might nevertheless animate their public lives in the present. As Melvin Rogers has powerfully argued, judgment is a function of citizenship, and public appeals to fellow citizens, quote, presuppose their capacity to judge. That is, I share my judgments of the world around me, whether I think it is just or unjust, beautiful or ugly, and so on, because I think those to whom I'm appealing are also capable of making those judgments, and I think that my judgments bear some weight. It means that my evaluation of the world we share deserves consideration, and so do the evaluations of my peers. If I make the case to you here today that AUM is a lovely campus, it's because I want my judgment of the world we share at this moment to matter. And I think your impressions matter too. I'm appealing to you. I'm appealing to your judgment with that belief. Black aesthetic judgment of a world in common positions Black Americans as citizens whose experience and reason hold weight, even if their citizenship has been denied in more formal legal terms. Appealing to judgment, as Rogers says, quote, reflects the political possibility latent within us all. To demonstrate what this looks like, I want to tell you in closing what Matthew does when he grows disillusioned with the possibilities of his day-to-day work. He writes, not to his senator or representative, but to Cotilia, many miles away. That correspondence actually shares many of the characteristics that Du Bois assigns beauty as a civic ideal. First, Du Bois describes the correspondence itself as beautiful. Describing the very first thing Cotilia writes Matthew, a note that she hands him, he writes, and then suddenly the letters started out from the page and burned his gaze. They flamed and spread before him. He saw the strong beauty of the great curves, the breadth and delicate uplifting of the capitals, the long, sure sweep of the slurred links. So this description, of course, is pretty obviously also fused with Matthew's romantic intentions, but I don't think that that's the end of the story. The letters he and Cotilia exchange in this last part of the novel, which form the bulk of the novel's last section, serve as a source of fulfillment for Matthew in ways that approximate the value Du Bois accords art in his 1938 address, his commencement address. If Matthew finds the world around him ugly and unjust, his correspondence is actually full of discussions, at times debates, on a wide range of ideals of what a good society might be, including beauty, justice, work, democracy, and love. It is here, primarily in these letters, that Matthew is able to approximate the fulfillment, in some respects, of life that Du Bois describes earlier. the fullest, most complete enjoyment of the possibilities of human existence, as he says. Nor, moreover, should we read this as simply Du Bois's ideal of what a private romantic correspondence or friendship, maybe, should look like. Cotilia and Matthews' letter writing is, for Du Bois, symbolic of a broader public connection between Black America and anti-colonial movements across the globe. And it results in real political changes in the novel, momentous ones. In other words, the at times, the correspondence that forms Dark Princess's last part is in important ways a symbol of how Du Bois understands beauty as a civic ideal to work in democracy's shadow. If beauty as a civic ideal shapes the judgments of the excluded and dominated, there is a civic artistry in sharing those judgments in the public sphere. Crafting that public sphere is a kind of work, and it can be guided by the same ideals of beauty, truth, and justice that for Du Bois should guide the Black artist. It is, moreover, a work which the racialized boundaries of the American state cannot foreclose. The public always exceeds whatever boundaries are set to we the people. In Du Bois's imagination, the public sphere to which Black citizens contribute, in fact, spans the globe. The writings and speeches I have quoted from Du Bois in this presentation are themselves, one could argue, part of this work, part of this civic artistry. The legacy of Reconstruction remains at once tragedy and possibility for American democracy. Today, intellectuals and social movements often draw on its memory and project the possibility, as William Reverend Barber has said, of a third Reconstruction, the civil rights movement often described as a second Reconstruction. In Du Bois, we find that reconstructing democracy is always, at least in part, a cultural project. It has always meant reconstructing democratic citizenship. And while it may be that the effort of building new democratic institutions worthy of Reconstruction's legacy is a slow or generations-long struggle, it's also true that the civic ideals and dispositions that might guide that process are realizable in the undemocratic present. The core to that citizenship, Du Bois tells us, is beauty in the activities that make something beautiful. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, if you can come down, that would be great. We have time for questions, and I want to make sure I look for hands before I start going too far. Yes.
What inspired you the most about W.E.B. Du Bois?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I think that's a good question. I mean, for me, I actually started thinking about Du Bois at the very beginning of graduate school. That's why I went to graduate school, was to study Du Bois originally. And at the time, I was really influenced by his ethical visions. But over time, I think that for me, the ways that Du Bois tried to live according to his political, moral, and aesthetic ideals is part of the sort of drama of his life and part of what draws me in. You know, he's somebody who lived for 95 years, right? From a kind of Victorian context. I think he wrote his, first paper on like Otto von Bismarck, to his passing away in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana in 1963, right before the March on Washington, right? So he's extraordinary. His thought is extraordinarily expansive. He's someone who is always transforming in many ways, and he's somebody who shaped the context of so many movements and philosophies. There's a book, kind of one of the most famous books on Du Bois's political thought is called In the Shadow of Du Bois by Robert Gooding Williams, right? He's talking about how African-American intellectual traditions remain sort of in the shadow of Du Bois's contributions in thinking. So.
Walk all the way over to Kevin.
I want to ask a question about the relationship between two parts of what you said about his view of aesthetics in the first part of the paper. The first idea is that all art is propaganda, right? This idea that every art reinforces or criticizes some kind of set of ideology. Maybe that's true of much art. I don't know if it's true of all of art, but right, that's the first idea. And the second is there's something good about the spread of art, right? Like it's beneficial. And that can be true of some art, right? But the spread of some art can actually, some can be liberatory, some can be oppressive. So I think about the way in which during Reconstruction, right, the spread of statues of Confederate generals, right, spread massively across the South as a way of reminding folks, right, of a culture that really had not changed even if slavery had ended. So can you say something about this idea of how art as propaganda and art as good to be shared relate in these sorts of contexts?
Definitely, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think for Du Bois, central to his idea of art as propaganda as a kind of positive thing is that he's thinking about sort of two kinds of propaganda, maybe, positive and negative, right? So there's a lot of negative propaganda, art that serves a negative political function that he thinks is, that does not uphold standards of, in his terms, truth and justice. So art that dehumanizes, for example. But there's also, a kind of picture of, this is actually, I guess I'm drawing on Melvin Rogers' book, his recent book, A Fair Amount Here, because he actually also uses the term positive propaganda, which would be art that does actually kind of affirm humanity, art that does reflect the truth of knowledge and experience on the part of those it represents. And so I think that, for Du Bois, the answer might lie in the division of these two kinds of versions of that claim. Thank you.
This is where I get my steps for the day.
I'm going to jump ahead, kind of piggybacking on what he just asked you. The idea of beauty and citizenship that he wrote is almost a predecessor to modern art, and not necessarily a propaganda, but more of an expression of change, and that modern art tried to do, being more untainted and kind of in a way of the art and literature is a bit political and to change your mindset. But when I studied it, I don't remember studying what he said. And it seems like he's echoing or almost giving an influence to the modern art movement. Did you ever study this or look into this?
That's really interesting. So I think that for kind of my focus, at least, I think that what he means by art is sort of possibly two different things, right? So the one hand, there's the question of like art as creative expression that we typically assign to something like painting or music or architecture, and the political functions that can have. But then I'm also, when I'm talking about civic artistry, I'm really thinking more broadly of the kind of creative acts of citizens who are constructing a society in common. And that could be any number of things, but that maybe exceed the boundaries of painting or music or other things. So that's a long answer, or a long way of saying that I don't know, but that sounds really interesting. I mean, are there particular kinds of themes or conversations that you think are kind of anticipated
Well,
here?
the modern art movement itself was more of like an untainted look of not looking at what is around you, but more of what is inside you before you learn, before you become a part of an environment and it becomes you, kind of getting back to the mindset of a child that's an innocent look, and that is your modern art movement, that you haven't been influenced by society yet. And so your art is an expression of your inner self. And I feel like what he's saying is that even if you look at some African American art during that time period, it's an expression of that innocence and trying to bring society together and not being so. It was more of a socialist kind of movement, that a freedom of expression that's not dictated by what you're being told to do. And I feel like he, in his writings, is almost leading into that modern art movement of what they were trying to express too. And if you look at some African American artists in the Harlem Renaissance, that they were the beginning of that, but it's not studied, and I don't remember studying that, the art movement at all, of what he's saying, because it seems to me like it's a big moving point in art and literature, and even what happened going forward from the 40s to the 60s.
That's really interesting. Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, he was. I mean, he was oftentimes understood or received as being kind of what would be the term? He's often contrasted with somebody like Alain Locke, right? They have this famous debate in the 1920s, precisely on the subject of propaganda. Should art have a specific political function? But, you know, art is for Du Bois also a source of extraordinary freedom. He's a really great admirer of Jean Toomer's cane, right? So I'm not sure that I have a very good answer, but that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Molly.
Can civic artistry exist in an online space? And what influence does or would it have in this era of Reconstruction if we are in the third era?
Wow, that's really helpful. Thank you. Wow. I would imagine that for Du Bois, you know, according to his definition, that it could, right? You know, the construction of online communities, online resources that coincide with, you know, this sort of civic ideal of beauty. I would imagine that is possible. Are there particular kinds of communities or resources online that maybe you had in mind that you think might kind of accord with us in some way?
Not particularly, but one of the things that has come up a few times in the tables I've been at is the lack of a centralized movement, like within the Black Lives Matter movement, how it's hard for there to be like a central idea, core values, core functions when they're like the civil rights movement had religion binding a lot of it together. They were working towards a common goal under God. So I'm wondering if the online space is where everybody exists. Is there a way to find that commonality through civic artistry, through creating these spaces, creating resources, creating groups, and supporting one another that way? And I don't know, maybe is there a way for us all to move forward, even if it is an indigenous space? Advocacy.
That's interesting. I wonder. I mean, I think that certainly, you know, something like the Movement for Black Lives platform, right, offers some grounding vision, right, connecting the movement. And certainly, online media has been a really important part of that movement. But in terms of the kind of creative potential of like constructing something in a civic sense online, I'm sure that there are efforts in that regard. Although I think I'd have to learn more about what that looks like. That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I want to ask a question relative to the sites that we visited this week. One of the questions that came up in our last session with the summer seminar was, how do places like the Legacy Museum express a kind of civic virtue? And so now I'm interested in what always strikes me when I walk through the Legacy Museum, and then yesterday as we walked through the sculpture park, is the sheer beauty of the art in that space. So I'm wondering if you might help me make some connections between Du Bois's civic thought here and the thrust of your argument in the paper, and the expressive artistic beauty that we see in those spaces as a kind of as a way of enacting civic virtue in those spaces.
It's really helpful.
So this is another way of saying, can you apply your talk to that specific space?
Well, and that's really helpful. I mean, where I am right now is still somewhat abstract and definitely very rooted in sort of like the text. And so thinking about these examples is really useful, really helpful. I think that one thing that struck me, both at the Legacy Museum as well as the museum in Birmingham, was the fact that this was the individuals who constructed these spaces, who staff them, right, who provide guidance for those who visit them, are performing a civic act, right? And it's a creative, constructive act, right? It's creating something that wasn't there before. And the thing that they've created is, as I think you mentioned, is beautiful. You're struck by it. You're moved by it when you move through these spaces. And I think, that beauty is also very much guided by particular truths that they're trying to communicate, as well as moral principles that underlie the presentation of the materials that are there, and that maybe even animate the sort of mentality and ethic of the people who are guiding people through them. I was really struck by the character of people who were at the 16th Street Baptist Church, right, who are voluntarily guiding us through this history, keeping this memory alive, and have reshaped their institution. I mean, have made a true sacrifice, taking aside a piece of their institution for that purpose. And so I think that there is something. I know I was thinking about these themes as I was going through those places, and I was thinking that there's something about it that does feel in line with Du Bois's idea of beauty as a civic ideal and sort of civic artistry as a form of citizenship and activity. And that also, for example, in Birmingham, we were talking about this last night, contrasts with, for example, the devastation done to the neighborhood around the civil rights district, right, by urban renewal and the policies of white politicians. And so that seemed to me to be certainly applicable. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and that question stands between you and lunch. So, yes, Lynn.
I think in several conversations we've talked about the hate that we could see as we, learned about, say, the bombing and the bombers. And when you read the quote about the planters' arrogance and that they were kinglets because they had made themselves the actual master of mind and body of other human beings, it just made me think about how it is that the white mindset changes and loses humanity. And I was wondering what you think Du Bois would say about that.
Yeah, I'm always struck by that. that part of Black Reconstruction, and really the whole chapter is like that. It's really an extended sort of diagnosis, almost of a kind of spiritual sickness, and it's a really fascinating chapter. Also, one that is really, I'm sure it's always been striking to read and resonant, but certainly feels resonant today. But I mean, for Du Bois, although I think it's complicated and it depends on where you're looking in his body of thought, the interpretation I'm fairly influenced by is that this is part of the social heritage of slavery, that it is both a disposition rooted in someone else's dehumanization, as a way of kind of forming one's own character. And that the ends being pursued are also kind of shaped by that social heritage. And so, of course, that changes over time. So by the 1920s and 30s, he's not just talking about, for example, the social heritage of slavery in the same way that it might have manifested in the 1870s, but also, for example, U.S. imperialism, right? The ways that colonial relationships in the United States, as well as in Europe, manifest a kind of sort of exporting or renewing of the role of the overseer on the part of many whites. And so I think that it's a kind of heritage that maintains a kind of core, but that transforms through historical contexts.
All right. On that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Dan Henry.
Thank you.